Within this section of the toolkit, we're focused on reflective practice, both the theories of reflective practice, as well as enhancing your understanding of different methods of engaging in reflective practice. There are readings that we have suggested, as well as activities you can engage in to develop a better understanding of the theories of reflective practice, and also to help you develop a habit of reflective practice, including engaging with the autobiography of the question.
So for me, in thinking about reflective practice and the kinds of training that we've been developing and designing at RARA, I am very influenced by the work of Jane Miller and the autobiography of the question. It's work that researchers typically use to position themselves in relation to the research questions and the participants that they're researching. Penny Jane Burke, for example, in her book The Right to Higher Education, uses it, and I've used it myself in my PhD. However, I think it has concepts in it which are also very useful to thinking about positionality and reflexive practice in terms of interventions that you may do with students and the way you might think about your learning and teaching, and how you might see yourself in the context of personal tutoring relating to your tutees. The autobiography of the question is asking you to think very deeply about who you are and position yourself so that you know who you are, who your students are, and can understand who's missing and where there may be fractures and differences, and just being very transparent about that. Because openness and transparency about our biases and our own privilege and our own position in the world is something that's very important to tackling social inequalities. It may not be a remedy in its own right, but it's the first step in a journey which will help create a culture which will help overcome some of them. In higher education, it's very easy when we're asked to talk about ourselves to hide behind our academic qualifications. However, the autobiography of the question is about actually asking you to think a little bit more deeply about who you are and why you're where you are and what journey you have been on to get there. The autobiography of the question is about thinking very deeply about who you are in relation to your work and practice. It would be very easy in higher education to list off your career and talk about yourself in terms of the awards and prestige and the jobs that you've had. But actually, that doesn't really tell you deep down about who you are. That doesn't declare about the biases and the prejudices and the privileges that you've had in making that journey, and how those things might shape how you respond and interact with students.
For me, when I think about exploring the autobiography of the question and who I am and how that relates to my career progression and my experience in academia, it starts with not being expected to go to university. So coming from a background where I was raised by a single mother, living in poverty, including times of food insecurity and housing insecurity, including times of violence in the household and addiction in the household, I was not expected to be a student in university. And so for me, it's important to recognize which students feel legitimate and who do not feel legitimate in my classrooms. So when I'm a teacher, when I'm a researcher, when I'm giving presentations, it's important for me to think about whose voices are heard and whose voices are not heard, whose contributions are valued, who's expected to be there, and who is missing. I usually will, when I'm open about my experience, I'll usually talk about my accolades first, like the fact that I got a PhD unconditionally without corrections, or the fact that 1 year after I completed my PhD, I co-wrote a grant for £500,000. And then I followed it up by making clear that I also come from a background where my father spent time in prison. These are things that deeply impact who I am as a scholar, but also how I approach my research and who I think about when I think about my teaching. So for me, it's important when I consider my reflective practices to think about how I engage my students and whether or not what I'm doing is making sure that the voices who are least likely to be heard are able to be amplified in my classroom.
My class, for example, is something that is a very complicated factor for me in higher education, and is something in which I actually grew up in a small town where something like W.H. Smith's or Waterstones was the leader of the high street. And in 2008, when there was the economic crash, the centre of that town was torn apart. There is the same fact that in that space, my ethnicity is something which probably goes unquestioned, and that I have an awful lot of white privilege to be able to lead this project. That's something really important that I need to think about and keep in check. I also have a disability, which is an unseen disability in my dyslexia. It's something which, when you have a supportive team around you who are proofing your slides and doing things like that, you can pass very well in that space. And really, in being very open and honest about the factors that have shaped me and taken me on the journey in my career, it gives me an opportunity to reflect on who are the students that we actually engage with and who's missing from that equation. And that's really been key in the training that we've done with personal tutors in terms of getting them to reflect. We need to listen to our students, we need to listen to ourselves, and we need to think about who's missing in higher education and our practice as a result.